Let me welcome you all, and more specifically, of course, the two excellencies at my left-hand side, Ambassador Brengelmann, representing the Federal Republic of Germany in the Netherlands already for quite a number of years, and on his left side, the French ambassador, Louis Vassy, representing La France, aux Pays-Bas. I should say a few words in French, because if it were NATO, it would be half English, half French. For the rest, I'll do it in English. Welcome to all the students listening online. I have to make one remark, and that is that when you're watching online, you can, of course, use the chat. And you do that through world.joinlive.tv. world.joinlive.tv. So, welcome on. French-German relations and the European Union. And you here in the room and online, you are in front of a manual. Our gender balance is not right. Had it not been for Brexit, we would have had 3 ambassadors without any doubt, and the UK ambassador joined Europa. But given the fact that the EU is our central theme today, we are very happy, not happy to have a panel, but to have the 2 ambassadors. 2 ambassadors representing, not only being experienced diplomats, but representing 2 heavyweights in the European Union, who should and who are taking responsibility for the well-being of the European Union. That unique, what I would qualify as construct under permanent construction. What do our 2 guests have in common? Without any doubt, they have a lot in common. But relevant for us today is the letter, the joint letter they wrote to Beste Nederlanders, dear friends in the Netherlands. And it's not every day that we as Dutchmen receive a letter co-signed by the ambassadors of France and Germany. That letter, and we'll certainly discuss it, contained 4 messages from France and from Germany. It spoke about the necessity for unity, for solidarity, for ambition, and last but not least, for an effort to protect the rules-based international order. I say again, that letter will certainly be the trigger for our discussion. I'll give the floor to the ambassadors in a moment. They both will introduce the topic for about 10 minutes each, and then we go to the Q&A. You can raise your hand here in the room, and of course online, as I said, you can do it through the chat. Perhaps I could ask Ambassador Brengelmann to take the floor first. Ambassador Brengelmann, lieber Dirk, please.
Thank you very much, and Professor and dear Jaap. We know each other indeed for many years. I served at NATO twice, and when I left, he came in. When I came back, he was still there. So we have seen each other over many years. And I will tell you one thing, which is that I will be retiring soon, going home to my home area of Bonn, Rhineland, and I will teach security policy at the University of Bonn. So where did I get that idea? Here in Leiden, looking at what Jaap de Hoop Scheffer did with his master classes, and you kindly invited me to attend some of those and speak to the students. And I think it's always good also for an ambassador or politician to be forced to actually present his ideas to a younger audience and then see whether in the Q&A you can actually answer their questions, or whether they have questions you find very difficult for your current thinking, because might be it's a little bit outdated. So it is an interesting situation for an ambassador, and I think in general, I think many of us should be going out more, talk to universities, talk to other areas of society, and not just sit in their little offices. So that as starters. When it comes to the role of our 2 countries in the European Union, let me start with something I experienced myself many, many years ago when I actually joined the Foreign Office. And we had so many debates about whether it should be more the European Union or should it be more NATO. So many of these debates are not completely new. Are we more Anglo-Saxon or are we more Gaullist, as it was called in those days? There were the Angelsachsen and the Gaullisten in the German system. And I think, to make a long story short, the reality is that after what we have seen in our continent for decades, it is very essential that Germany and France have come to good terms with each other, now actually live in a state of friendship with each other, which is not just at the top level, but going down to the citizen. Actually, when you look at something which I think the English would call it twinning, in French it's jumelage. My hometown has a jumelage with Berck-sur-Mer in Normandy, so every German city does have this jumelage and people would visit. Between us and the Dutch, that has always been like this, and now is the moment where the Germans come, okay, it's Corona, but where Germans come to the Netherlands in droves, and you would find cars with number plates from my area, Rhineland and Ruhrgebiet, all over. But that has always been like this. It was always something which was just normal. But nowadays, I think the good thing about our political consultation and cooperation is it's not just the top, it is also the citizen. And we just had a meeting, funnily enough, the two of us with Dutch journalists. And the journalists made a good argument that why can we do more in Europe together? Why is there less antagonism nowadays? And they said, look, for example, at the way we Dutch were looking at football games with the Germans many years ago. It was a little bit like a war. What happened when the Germans and the French played football? It was a little bit like a war. And then the Dutch journalists told us, if we are looking at games today, certainly we want the Dutch to win. If the Dutch can't make it, the second team we will root for is the Belgian. And if the Belgians cannot do it, then we'll look for the Germans. This is something which seems like, you know, football is always a nice story to talk about, but it shows something more. It shows something deeper, which is the level of feeling normal about being together with each other. Germany and France have always come together when the European Union was at decisive moments. It is a Dutch city, Maastricht, which established one of the fundamental treaties, but it was at that time a letter by President Mitterrand and Chancellor Kohl which got that process going, leading to the Maastricht Conference and eventually to the Maastricht Treaty. And you just referred to a joint letter we did in March last year in the AD, and later we had a joint letter by President Macron and Chancellor Merkel with respect to the economic recovery package as an answer to the pandemic. And did we see some reaction from the Dutch? Yes. Many found it a little bit difficult to accept that the idea that the German and French ambassador would come out together and talk to them in their way we did. By the way, we didn't attack Wopke Hoekstra. It was the newspaper who made a point of mentioning that it was a response to Wopke Hoekstra. We haven't said that in our article. But there was some level of surprise and indignation a little bit. Why would you, the French and German, think you can tell us how to move ahead? And there was even more, to be honest with you. Some of the Dutch reactions were, how come you Germans would do that, that proposal on spending money? How would you do that together with the French? Have you gone thraus, so to say? And they also told me that they were really surprised. And that moment, I was very sorry. I had to tell these Dutch politicians that if they are so surprised, then the other sentence which they had used, that they know Germany so well, might perhaps not be so true. Because if they knew Germany that well, they should have known that in a moment like this, a German chancellor will move. Because yes, as a German chancellor, you go to the European Council and you represent your national interests in the first place, which is what you expect in every nation from your political leader. But yes, since, even before Kohl, since days back, a German chancellor does feel a certain level of European responsibility. Even at some point, it cannot be 100% in line with our own national interests. And that is something which I think people should have seen in that moment. People who think they know Germany should have seen that Germany in one way or the other would move. It had been a process before that letter of 2 years, basically, I think, where Germany and France were discussing together proposals on how moving forward in Europe. You had seen, I think that were the main hallmarks, the speech of President Macron at the Sorbonne University. You had the meeting between President Macron and Chancellor Merkel in Meseberg, and you had a German paper coming out of a conference in Meseberg, which is a place near Berlin. So it took some time, and sometimes that there is a very different way of acting, because in France we have a presidential system, so the president makes a call, and then the country basically, or the government knows what to do. In Germany it's more complex. We have coalition governments, we have a federal system, so you need to make sure that at least the most powerful prime ministers of the Bundesländer, especially of your own party, would back you up. So all of that led to a certain hesitation, but in the end it was a very strong and decisive reaction. The Dutch reaction at that time, not from all, but from some, isn't that a bit of a directorat, so to say, by the German and French, was counteracted by many other reactions we got of people who were saying that they were so happy that we actually made that point of debate. And I can tell you, we have had, the newspaper told us they have a circulation of 400,000, and by the internet, another 400,000 were looking at it. We got on Twitter and on email system, we got some reaction, some not so positive, some positive, but the reactions in total were only 150, 200. So out of the 800,000 who had actually looked at it, the reaction was not so much as sometimes social media would make you think. And the point I want to make now is that this was a contribution. And that is sometimes something which here in this country people underestimate, the possibility of the Netherlands to play a strong role within the European Union. To be blunt with you, the Dutch, in a sense, are punching sometimes even above their weight line, because on many instances they are, so to say, number 3 in terms of influence, impact. On many issues they are. So it is not like, you know, there are 2 countries who can call the shots and the rest has to see where it stands. That's not the reality anymore. And that's even not what we, the Germans and the French, think we could do. We don't think that way. We want to make a contribution, and we realize that when our 2 countries come forward with a certain view, it has a strong impact, but it's not in any sense trying to be a directorate. That was never the way as we looked upon it. I think for the future, and then I would like my French colleague to come, for the future I think Europe and including the Netherlands need to be aware of one thing. We have big strategic debates on how do we relate to the debate between the US and China, how do we relate to Russia and the relationship between the US and Russia, how do we relate to the future of the European Union and its cooperation with NATO, how do we relate to our immediate surroundings and neighborhood, which from time to time migration, etc., has been difficult for us. All of us, including Germany and France, know that we are not able to cope with that on a, I would say that, Augenhöhe, equal eye level with other big players if we don't work together as the European Union. That includes my country, that includes his country. All of us on our own would be taken advantage of, and the Chinese would, for example, be very much at ease playing off one against the other. So if we are not working together, we have no chance in that process, in that situation now where we need to find answers to the main questions for the future. And I think that the situation we have had last year has shown that Europe can come together, that we can act together. Has everything been perfect? No. Even in Germany, there was a lot of debate on what have you, vaccination, etc. But in reality, I think we would still come to the same conclusions which we have had last year. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Many thanks. Let's
Thank you, and thank you, Jaap, and thank you, Dirk. I'm really glad to be here. Also because it's an indication that we are slightly but surely going back to normal in our organization. So today is hybrid, and maybe one of these days next year we'll be able to have a room without such distancing. I'd like maybe, so I'll be brief because I'm like Dirk, I'm very much interested in hearing what are the questions from the room and the kind of preoccupations that your generation has. I would simply point maybe two things in terms of the French-German relation. I think it has two realities in a way. It has one bilateral reality where the two countries, I think also in view of their historic responsibility in terms of the stability of the European continent, need to make sure that at all times they understand each other well, that all channels of communications are open, that they bridge the gap as much as possible on as many issues as possible, and that when it appears that it's not possible to bridge the gap, which happens not too often, to be honest, but it can happen in on a couple of policy issues, we do it in a way that doesn't harm the overall relation. And maybe just I'd like to, in that context, I'd like to point out that what is going on is pretty intense in terms of making sure that we work together. It's true, of course, of our diplomacies, and I think with Dirk, the letter you mentioned, in fact, is a testimony of that work we do together. But it's true that we see each other a lot. We share impressions, we do things together here in The Hague, and that's true all over the place. For example, we've decided to be working much more together at the UN these last few years, and I was physically present when in March and April 2019, for example, so we were chairing the Security Council. I think Germany was March and we were April. So we decided to, in fact, have a kind of joint French-German presidency of the Security Council, which means sharing the agenda, making sure that you pursue the same priorities of the other partner, and that translated into a joint visit by our two foreign ministers, Jean-Yves Le Drian and Heiko Maas, during 4 days in New York together, the last 2 days of our presidency and the first 2 days of the German presidency, or the other way around, I don't remember now, making sure that we were pushing together this joint agenda. We are exchanging diplomats a lot. We are on coordinating on a very, very vast range of policy issues. And what is true for foreign policies, in fact, also true in pretty much all realms of public policies, which translates, in fact, into a very formal organization around the French-German Council of Ministers. So basically, the two cabinets very regularly joining for a joint meeting and going through policy issues. I think Germany has that in a different setting with the Netherlands. We have that with Italy and Spain also. But in the French-German Council of Ministers, it's really a very heavy mechanic of making sure that all policy agenda issues are brought together to an extent, and then it translates into a whole range of very practical projects, including, for example, exchange of our language training, exchange of between our youth, between the two countries. It means also, of course, the joint media, Arte, for example. So it's in fact the whole life of the two countries that is brought together to make sure that, again, doesn't mean we absolutely agree on everything, but that we make sure that we create this intimacy. And I think it's my transition for the European point that is extremely important because, of course, we have a very similar set of values, all of us Europeans. They are even enshrined in our treaties, but they have been developing through different routes. And if you're French, you think Europe is basically the Greco-Roman heritage and the Enlightenment, so basically us. And if you're German, I guess you see more Reformation, Rhineland, and it's also the case, by the way, here in this country with Spinoza, Erasmus, etc. We all have our different roots. That means a different way of thinking also, and that in the end needs to converge to create the broadest possible platform of agreement. Then what do we bring to the European discussion? Of course, I think there's a specific German-French responsibility as the two, let's say, major economies, and of course two states that have been extremely supportive of the European project from the beginning. I think it's fair to say that to some extent the whole project is about making sure that France and Germany do not get at each other's throats once again, as we've been doing since for many centuries, but more specifically for 3 wars at least, beginning in 1870. And of course, to some extent, it is also about that relation. And when we come to the table, of course, as Dirk says, it's always, let's say, a beginning. The European Union has been expanding. It's certainly not a French-German adventure at all anymore. But our initiative can give impetus, let's say, and in a way. I think it's also a question of the articulation between the European institutions and the national level. A lot now with the new Commission has been about the geopolitical Commission, and I think we all welcome that, the fact that we have strategic threats and challenges and that we need to address them in a strategic way. That might be a little bit, the fact that the Commission needs to say it also illustrates that it's a bit new for European institutions, whereas it has been for national diplomacies and national governments, it has always been about that in a way. And so it is true that on many instances what we can bring is the vision to change the way things are working for the better, you know. And so I think what we did last year for the recovery plan was by all means not the end of the story, but when France and Germany say, look, we have this very specific challenge of our economies completely closing down, we will need to do some solidarity and recovery. Of course, we were looking beyond the current setting of the European Union. And since we do things like that, we will continue doing it. A few days ago, our two leaders were in Berlin, and there was a whole development on increasing cooperations in the health sector. Not meaning, of course, it remains a national policy, but there are issues that will be dealt with better at the European level, including monitoring the emergence of new viruses, making sure that we have an alert or a warning system that is integrated so that we don't miss the next signals of the emergence of an epidemic. And there is, of course, in that regard, a line on the possibility of increasing the role of the European Medical Agency that is a few kilometers from here in Amsterdam, and has played a very crucial role in validating the vaccines that we are now using. So I think that's about it. It's this intimacy that we've been creating bilaterally gives us the possibility to have the lines moving in terms of the European debate when it's needed and when we feel that additional cooperation or integration will actually bring something positive to the overall European adventure.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Let me open the discussion. First of all, by relaying a question by Max van Wijk, and then I'll have a personal question attached to that. Max van Wijk asks, what will change in the diplomatic relationship between you, the two of you, your nations, when there is a new president or Bundeskanzler elected? And I would complete the question by asking you, elections in Germany in the fall, a chancellor with a huge authority is leaving the scene. Presidential elections in France next April, May, in 2 rounds. To what extent do you expect that Europe and the European Union will play a role, and if so, what role would that be? Dirk, may I start with you?
I think in German elections, Europe is, in a sense, always there, but usually not as one of the most hotly debated issues. There will be other issues like climate and how to deal with the pandemic, which will be, I think, first in line. On Europe and the importance of the European Union and our cooperation in the European Union, I think when you look at the 3 Kanzlerkandidaten, I don't think you would find too much of a difference there. All of them would agree that we should basically continue the cooperation, our role in the European Union. You know, in our politics, we are a very regional country. You have, as I said, 3 Spitzenkandidaten. 2 of them, as is tradition in Germany, have been or are currently Ministerpräsidenten or heads of a federal state. So when you are Olaf Scholz coming from Hamburg, you have always had a very close situation vis-à-vis Scandinavian countries, for example. It's true that Armin Laschet, who is the candidate of the CDU and the Prime Minister of North Rhine-Westphalia, actually from the city of Aachen, he has cooperation with the Benelux in his DNA. And he's right now as we call it, has special responsibilities because culture is a thing for the federal states. He's the one coordinating cultural relations with France at this moment, because this is done on the level of federal states. And so that it's more difficult to say that vis-à-vis Annalena Baerbock, because she is not representing a particular state, but she is party chairman for some time. And also with her, I would not expect there to be a fundamental change or shift in the German views on Europe.
Maybe just before I enter into more specifics, I think, since I guess there are lots of European students in the room and online, it is actually sometimes a bit troubling that the political space, the European political space, is not so much integrated in a way. So each of us knows pretty much all the names of any Supreme Court nominee in the United States. True fact. I mean, most people, let's say, that are interested in international relations know everything about the current US Supreme Court and if it will or will not validate Obamacare or uphold Obamacare. And we don't know of enough of each other's politics, and that is frankly a bit troubling because I would argue it has a much bigger impact actually on our daily lives potentially than what happens on the other side of the Atlantic. Not to say that we shouldn't care about the United States, we should, but sometimes that is a bit surprising. I guess that it has to do with language, to be honest, because in the end, of course, our politics is in French, and German politics is in German, and Dutch politics is in Dutch, and our inability, in fact, to understand each other makes it more complicated. So if I have one core message that I've been defending with Dirk these last few years is please learn European languages, or you will be missing out on the on a lot that is going on in countries that are actually extremely important for yourself. I try to uphold that exigence for myself in trying to learn a little bit of Dutch, and to be honest, it helps. It means that at least now I can read the newspaper here and understand a little bit what's going on, even though everyone is very nice with me in speaking or interacting with me in English. But the idea that you can understand Europe exclusively through the, let's say, international English that we are all using, I think misses a point. So it's a long detour to go back to the situation in our countries. I think, to be fair, so our election is a bit far away. It's difficult to know how things will play out. The only thing I would say is that it's well known that in the last election cycle, Europe was clearly at the center of the discussion, and it's been one of the major themes since then of our political life. And sometimes, that's the only thing I would say at this point, we have a little tendency to be extremely harsh on ourselves and not acknowledging things that in fact are working, including in the management of the pandemic. If we are a little bit honest with ourselves, we've been able to actually vote and adopt a recovery plan in 4 months, 5 months only. All parliaments have ratified the said recovery plan, which will soon enter into force in national to the benefit of European economies. The European agency has been able to and examine and endorse the vaccines that were submitted to it. And I think we are now extremely glad that it did so, because we actually, as a matter of fact, what we see is that the vaccines that we've been using have been efficient if we look at the incidence rate of the pandemic in our countries. Of course, there was a slower start, but our vaccination campaign are doing very well. And so I would argue that we have collectively a little tendency to pinpoint or to focus on things that are not working perfectly, and that's human nature, and it's always good to be challenging oneself. At the same time, I would say that the discussion in the coming months might also be on the acknowledgement of some of the major successes we've experienced, including in the management of the epidemic. Today, I'm glad to say that in France, for example, we are at an incidence rate for COVID of 35, so pretty much completely under control in a way, and that's been achieved thanks to a very efficient vaccination campaign supported by common acquisitions at the European level. And so I guess we should be at this point proud of that.
Thank you so much. Let me go to the room here and see if there's any question coming from one of the students in the room. I see, all right, I see, and I know that she has to leave a bit early. I see Professor Dimitrova, and then I'll get to you. Professor Dimitrova, please.
I very much enjoy your call for European unity, which is, I think, very welcome given the challenges that you both mentioned to Europe. And without focusing too much on the critical perspective, as you were aiming not to do, there are two credibility challenges to European unity at the moment, which are both, in a sense, internal, but I think unless they are addressed, it will be more difficult to be credible towards China and Russia. And these are the rule of law challenge inside the European Union and Belarus. And on the latter, we just heard that Austria was vetoing the third package of sanctions to Belarus because of issues with Austrian banks. So my question to both of you is, to what extent are the French and German positions united on those two credibility challenges? And to what extent you see the tools that the Commission and the European Union has now developed, especially the rule of law regulation, as fit for the purpose?
Mr. Vassy, would you like to start answering this round?
I do, okay.
And then, of course,
look, on the substance, I think we are, yes, as nations, we are extremely aligned, specifically on the Russia-Belarus issue. It was also the case around the episode of Navalny, for example, where we worked also together, both here, by the way, in The Hague at the OPCW, and also in the European context. So then, of course, the reality of the functioning of the European Union is, of course, that on foreign policy issues it works on the basis of unanimity. That's how the system is organized today, and it means that other countries might have different sensitivities. Then on I would simply say that it is our responsibility, ours, I think, as countries, but in fact of all European countries, to approach issues, of course, taking into account their national interest, which is always pertinent and absolutely justified. I think what we've been able to do in our dialogue is to acknowledge that there is, it's not a zero-sum game, and so anything positive for the EU brings us an additional benefit in a way, and so sometimes that can lead you to moderate the urge to defend your very immediate national interest in order to reach compromise and make sure that, of course, you benefit overall, but while taking seeing also the overall picture. I think it's also fair to say that we've been consistently acknowledging that there are issues that cannot be dealt with at an other level than the European level. And it's something that President Macron has said time and again. There isn't a contradiction between our national sovereignty and the sovereignty we develop at the European level, because in fact, there are issues that are too big for the national level. And so the only, what is it to be sovereign if not controlling your destiny? And the only way for some issues to control your destiny is actually to pool together resources and leverage to make sure that you address them at the proper level. And China, of course, is clearly one of these challenges that we'll need to be looking at together. And I think we've done a lot in that regard. It's true that some of our partners engage, for example, in formats of discussion around the 17+1, that is now 16+1, with the departure of one of the members. And that, of course, creates the impression that it's possible to divide Europeans, and that's that's the kind of things, of course, we refrain from doing, because it's always a sign of weakness. What is the solution to disagreements on foreign policy issues? Is it to go to qualified majority? It's a complicated debate. I think at this point we would argue that the way to go is actually make sure that you are able to create consensus even on the countries that disagree. On rule of law, much shorter. I think it's a basic. I mean, the European Union is a union of values. They are actually integrated in the treaties. They are mentioned in the treaties, and so we need to abide by these standards. We have courts also to look into that. And I guess that under the German presidency, the fact that we've been able to find a way to integrate that aspect into the conditionalities for the recovery plan has been really a success of the German presidency that we should all welcome.
Mr. Brengelmann, would you like to on this question?
Yeah, thank you. I won't take that long because I agree with most of what Louis Vassy said. But before I go to that point, I would like to underline one of his points, because I also feel very strongly about it. That is, it is clear that English is our foreign language #1. That's true here, that's true in Germany. But at the same time, I find it a pity that when young people come together, it is difficult for them to communicate together in either German or Dutch. And the number of students in these two languages, and I know also that same for France, is pretty low. We are even now at the point that there are more German students doing Netherlands in German universities than the other way around. So on that one, I have an equally strong feeling because I think we missed chances there, because language is not just to write a quick message. Language is each other's culture and literature, etc. On the issue you just asked, that is very important for us, and Louis Vassy just referred to the very important issue we had to deal with during our presidency, when the whole deal on next generation and the budget was a little bit in the doldrums. And it was different nations, different views, but it was also the European Parliament. So it was really a conundrum. And that was probably one of the most difficult acts during our presidency, to reach that agreement, which wasn't the perfect agreement for either side. Some would have loved much less and some would have loved much more. But I think it was the thing which we could achieve at that time. And now we'll see how it works, because the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and we start the eating now. The debate on human rights has become ever more important, and how we deal with each other has become ever more important over the last years. You can see that vis-à-vis Russia, you can see that vis-à-vis China. Louis has just referred to that. And from time to time, governments are in difficult spots there, because on the one hand, you have the issue of economic cooperation, you have the issue of security in various forms, security in the classical sense, but nowadays much more than that. How about cyber, etc.? So that debate is with us, and again, I believe we can only have a role in that debate if we as Europeans stick together. My country from time to time is being thought as being weak on some of those because we are such an economic-oriented country. I hear that from time to time. Partly true, but last year it was Germany who took in Monsieur Navalny as he was sick because of his poisonous attack, and Merkel was not afraid of visiting him in the hospital. So we're not shying away from that debate. You made a particular point about Belarus. I've only picked up a news clip on that just before coming here, that it was for the Bank for Gemeinwirtschaft of Austria, but I will not go into that. I've only seen a news clip there, so that would be a bit daring to make a comment. On the last point which Louis just made, vis-à-vis how can we make sure we can still act? And we have seen lately some situations where the European Union was not able to issue a statement because one wouldn't want to agree to that, and then the European Union as such cannot do a statement. The High Representative can do a statement, but then it's formally speaking perhaps not quite the same. And there's a discussion on what could we do, the qualified majorities, one option. There is, and the treaty actually has this, there's this possibility of having what we call a constructive abstention. So there are various possibilities. I think that debate has now really started in earnest. And to be very blunt, I think that we cannot utter a word on the important situations. And what was the latest? I think it was Hong Kong, and then later it was Middle East, is just not good. So we need to come to terms with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we go to the room again. I'll take two questions. I'll take yours, and then I'll repeat it for the people online, and then I'll go to my left. Please.
Germany and France. So I guess more concretely, what is the Netherlands doing actively to support and stimulate this relationship?
The question is, what is the Netherlands actively doing, Netherlands-Dutch foreign policy vis-à-vis the relationship between Germany and France? And I read it, if I understand you correctly, is the Dutch government in its orientation sufficiently geared to France and Germany? Now that Dutch foreign policy after Brexit has lost one of its important anchors. I think I phrased it. Thank you so much. I'll go to you over there, please.
Yes, thank you. I'm curious how both you think about a common European defense strategy, and more specifically, if you see any future for a common European nuclear strategy.
A common European defense strategy, including a possible nuclear strategy in Europe. I link that to a question I see online posed by Victor Bouemar. And it reads, there have been mixed messages on the side of Germany with regards to France's desire to go further in European defense. And then there's a reference to Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer's statement on strategic economy being an illusion. And then it ends along the lines of your question, what is the position of Germany, and I would of course add, what is the position of France on European defense and NATO? Dirk, may I ask you to kick off?
There was quite a mix of big questions, so to say, but before, can I ask, are there actually any Germans and French in the audience? So two, so the three, sorry.
And French or German? German. Also German. And German. All right.
So the females from German take over. Thank you. You know, in the beginning I was wondering where the question would carry me, but in the end I got it. Let me start with one thing which we haven't said in the beginning, because we were talking about our cooperation and how we approach issues in the European Union. But let me say before that the bilateral relationship between our two countries is actually a very, very strong one. I'm coming to the end of my tenure here after being here as an ambassador for 5 years, and I must admit I've had some happy moments at the very end of my tenure, because actually, given Corona, I wasn't that sure. We have had the speech of Angela Merkel for the 5th of May, the Nationale Lesing, and I can tell you it means something for Germans to realize that the Dutch would invite a German chancellor for that occasion. And mind you, this invitation was for last year. It was for the 75 years, so that is special. And the other one will be, I think it has just publicly been announced 1 or 2 days ago, the King will make a state visit to Germany. I mean, albeit reduced, given the Corona situation, a little less fanfare, but it will be a state visit after he has made a tour over the last years of every Bundesland. He has been in Germany every year, sometimes visiting one Bundesland, other times 2 or even 3. So it is the conclusion of that touring of Germany that he will now come to state visit. For me, at the end of my tenure, that is something to relish. And when it comes to business, I'm not sure most Dutch don't know that. In our trade balance, the Dutch are actually number 2. So you are the 2nd biggest trading partner of Germany. For a 70 million people country, I think that's quite something to say. Last not least, we are also working very closely when it comes to defense, because that is an issue I see here. The Dutch-German Corps in Münster and our armies integrate. And I will not even go into the area of culture, because even an ambassador nowadays is not in a position to see what's happening between museums, theaters, etc. When you go to Nordrhein-Westfalen, you will find a lot of Dutch people in theater and museums, etc. And Wolf Reins, who's the head of the Stedelijk, just came back from Bonn, where he was the head of the Bundeskunsthalle. In terms of our cooperation, and Jaap, you just made the point, post-Brexit. Before the Brexit, let's be blunt, was always nice and easy to have a good balanced position between London and Bonn or Berlin. On the other hand, that kind of equilibrium, if you like, isn't there anymore. And you have seen various ways of reacting to that. One of these ways to react relates to us, because I think one can say that you have both increased your cooperation with Berlin and with Paris at the same time. So there's a lot of relationships between the government here and the government in Berlin and the government here and the government in Paris on various issues. It even goes deeper, because what I've experienced during my 5 years here is it's not just The Hague and Berlin, it's much more The Hague also and Düsseldorf, The Hague and Hannover with Landesregierungen, and even further down. I've always been present when the Commissaris de Koning from the border provinces meet with their counterparts on the German side and vice versa. So the relationship is on all levels down. And unfortunately, during the Corona pandemic, okay, we didn't need to have any border closures or controls, but the truth of the matter is, in terms of human context, human interaction, yeah, we have lost a little something, which now, when things become possible again, we need to make sure to keep moving. And the third element of your reaction was creating cooperation with other countries in different formats, in flexible formats, you might say. You have the Hanseatic League, and we will not forget the Sparsamen Vier last year. So that was an important group you formed. So yes, you have this tendency of having, for various issues, various formats, and that's fine, because that is how Europe does interact with each other. And I think it will basically remain a little bit on those different lines. When it comes to defense, there's always been a debate in Germany on, and I indicated that at the beginning, it has already been there 30, 40 years ago, the so-called Atlanticism vis-a-vis so-called Gaullists. That was a debate when I started diplomacy. It has become more European over the years because the European Union has made some progress in terms of integration. And let's not forget, I've been at NATO many years with SecGen, and you know, we have noticed the Americans expect us to do more. It is not like in the old days when you know, people in Washington would start shrieking if the Europeans were doing a little Tervuren or something like this. This was a hell 15 years ago, and nowadays they would expect us to do more. And I don't think there's a contradiction. Sometimes there's a hype in that, so to say, debate on whether or not it's a contradiction. I don't see a contradiction. There is different emphasis, and you referred to AKK in one of your questions. When I would see my minister Heiko Maas, there's probably more emphasis, but they are also from different political parties, etc. So I think if we come looking at it sanguinely, we have seen over the last years more of in PESCO, etc., common military projects in the European Union than 15, 20 years ago, where things like that were unthinkable. And right now, we have a debate on a level of interaction between NATO and the European Union, which we have never seen before. Mind you, we still have that problem related to the fact that Cyprus is in the European Union and Turkey is in NATO. That issue had been there a long time ago, it's still there. Thank you.
Luis Saru.
Very, very quickly, on defense, I think the overall debate has changed a lot in the last few years. As Dirk pointed, it's not an either-or question between NATO and the EU, and I seem to recall that even Dutch politicians framed it as not wanting to choose between your mother and your father, and so in a way, I think that's the spirit. When we say strategic autonomy, when we say European sovereignty, we don't frame it as hostile to or built against any organization, on even less country. We simply say the threats are evolving, the pressure from the outside is increasing. Our American partner, which is of course key to European security, has also rising challenges all over the world, including in the Pacific region. They say it themselves, so it's not anything new. And as Dirk said, I think they also expect us to do more. I don't think, and the question is, are we able to, as European, when it's necessary, to do things together on the defense side? I would simply mention two specific, two issues that are in fact the same, two sides of the same coin. First, it also needs to translate into a national debate, because you can speculate on NATO, the EU, etc. But in the end, the basic question is: do you have or don't you have capacities? I think it's also important, including in this country, that there is that debate that if you want to participate in whatever defense organization or setting, at some point you need to be able to bring capacities to the table. In France, we have now met the 2% threshold in terms of defense expenditure, and we feel also because the UK is now outside of the EU that we cannot be the only European EU country investing so much in defense, and that it needs to be a joint effort. I would also add that it is also, sovereignty in this regard is also an industrial issue, and I'm absolutely glad that France and Germany have been able together to push new, extremely high-end projects, including joint work on a 5th generation aircraft, and then we've been joined by other countries, so that is moving in the right direction, and also for the modernization of our land forces. And there will be, thanks to the adoption of the European Defence Fund, many more projects all over the place for European countries having their industries working together. The nuclear issue was touched upon in one of the questions. It's difficult to enter, of course, in any detail in that kind of issues, but I think it's simply fair to, I would simply say that, in essence, NATO recalls regularly that it is indeed a nuclear alliance, and we are all part of it, so that is actually part of our security. And in our instance, I will simply remind that President Macron in February 2020 made a speech on these issues where he said that we would be open to a discussion with partners that would be interested on the role and place of the French deterrence, specifically on European security. Very quickly on the Dutch and the French-German relation, in a way, maybe the Brexit changes things more for the French-Dutch relation than for the German-Dutch relation that has always been very intense. In our case, I think it's fair to say that it has always been good, but that it's become more intense. We've seen joint French-Dutch papers on trade, on carbon adjustment mechanism at the border, on digital, so things that we would not necessarily have seen in the 5 or 10 years ago. And I think indeed it's a testimony of the fact that the Dutch diplomacy repositions itself also in the European Union context, and that we reach out much more to the Netherlands also. And why do we do that? I think it goes back to a question we also got this a few hours ago. Why are you so present in the press, in the Dutch press, as ambassadors? And I would simply say that it's because the Netherlands matter, and their place in the European Union, of course, is central. The weight of the country is big. Brexit makes the Dutch economy the 5th economy of the EU. An economy that is also doing very well, and that means, of course, a need for more cooperation. And there are actually instances where we do work at 3, French, German, and Dutch, on specific policy issues, and I think it's always extremely useful and productive.
Let me add, coming back to the ambassador's comments, 2 things. First of all, I think, personal opinion of course, not on behalf of anybody else, I think the Dutch found out the hard way on the recovery fund last year that when France and Germany agree, the marge de manœuvre, to say it in French, of the Dutch is extremely limited. And I think we overestimated our margin of maneuver in that debate. Again, when the President de la République and the German Chancellor say, and more specifically the German Chancellor, the Schwarze Null, the balanced budget in Germany, when they go, I mean, the Dutch have not much to offer anymore. I apologize for sounding a bit cynical, but that is the way it is, I think. The second remark on defense, I think Ambassador Brengelmann made a very valid point when he said that's the American administration, let's forget about the previous, also the present American administration, is not going back to the days where right or wrong Pax Americana should be enforced at any place in the world. They will simply not do that, and that leads to a European responsibility which is bigger than it was in the past. Let me give you one example, and I'm looking at Ambassador Vassy, of course, in this regard. The Sahelian zone, the Sahel, where the French have trouble in Mali, Operation Barkhane, to have a stabilizing influence. I would think that would be, in my opinion, have to be a European project, quote unquote. And we cannot ring the doorbell of the White House and the Oval Office in the United States of America when things get out of hand in the Sahel. And that is, as you know, a very unstable region where terrorism meets migration, meets climate change, human trafficking, and what have you. So we have to. Although personally I'm not a huge fan, I've said this many times before, of the notion on defense. I'm not talking about other areas, strategic autonomy on defense. Because if you mention the word strategic autonomy, then you have to be able in the military domain, and then it's about the 2% and financing defense. You have to be able to project hard military power, and what is left after Brexit of projecting hard military power, without apologies, that's the French. Because the Germans are never in the forefront, nor are the small or medium-sized nations. Other questions? Yes, please. We take two again. Please, go ahead.
Your Excellencies, thank you. I had a question regarding your notion on America being one of the key strategic partners for European security. We see the Chinese influence from Beijing rising, and at the same time we see that Washington is getting sometimes in the background, but sometimes Washington comes with policies which make them seem again on the foreground again. And I'm speaking specifically when we look at the Middle East, where, for example, Washington and Moscow have certain interests. How do we, as Europeans, as EU, define our interest there? Because I feel that sometimes Moscow and Washington do not really care or care less about the European interest when certain policies are implemented regarding, neighboring countries in the MENA region, for example. So how can we voice our interest in a better way, or how can we define our interest? Because sometimes I see, if we look at the past 10, 20 years, I see certain policies were not in our interest, and that we are actually the direct neighbor of Turkey, and with that the MENA region, and that we pay actually the highest prices in that regard. While certain policies are implemented or taken by two capitals farther away over the sea. I know it's a very delicate and tough question, but like how, as Europeans, like now we need a call of more European unity, and the COVID pandemic has shown again our weakness and strength, and why we need to define our interests and unity again.
We're in academia, so delicate questions are definitely in order. Let me for the people online try to summarize the question. It is basically, if I've understood you correctly, about the Middle East, North Africa, the MENA region, and a European strategy, given the interests of other major powers in that region, be it Russia, be it the United States of America, be it usually the elephant in the room, be it China in this regard. I saw another hand being raised. Yes, please go. Two hands even. Please go ahead. Yes, you start and then you're yeah.
Yes, I was wondering, because I'm from the border region in the Netherlands, so the southern part, and I lived in Germany just over the border for most of my life. So you would think like in the border areas people go shop or cheap gas in Germany, but still, if you look at the voting paper in those areas, they're most skeptical of the Netherlands. So I was wondering, it's like we are here to have like with a group of people who are like really into EU, into politics, but I was wondering how would you say to the normal people, so to say, that the European Union is important and what it means?
The question is how to sell the European idea to you call normal people, to the man and woman in the street, as we say in Dutch, instead of discussing it at a more theoretical level as we used to do. I take one more question from you in the back, please.
Your Excellencies, Professor, thank you for coming. My name is Jaap de Hoop Scheffer. My question is very much related to what my fellow student just asked. It's related to what Ambassador Vassy said about participating in defense, and I would like to transfer that to participation in the European project. In light of the 2005 referenda in your country and in this country for a European constitution, which resulted in a no and a nay, and in addition to that, growing Euroscepticism and anti-EU parties in the Netherlands, we have a couple of them. How do you, as my fellow student said, convince Europeans to adhere to the EU project, given the said Euroscepticism? socially and economically from these two very traumatic cases? And a follow-up question, what is the biggest detriment of the EU for her member states at national level, and how can this be addressed? And I ask this in light of the capacity for EU law to override Dutch national law. In the Dutch Constitution, Articles 93 and 94 say that when there is a clash between national law and EU law will supersede Dutch law. And this can be very worrying for, what you said, maybe people, normal people, who don't know the intricacies of our supranational project. How do you convince them that their country isn't being stripped of sovereignty? How do you address them and saying that there is no democratic deficit, we have a European Parliament? And how do you say that Euroscepticism is not necessary? Let us continue with the European project together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Let me briefly summarize. This question is a follow-up of the previous one, and that is about the debate, political debate vis-à-vis the European Union, selling, quote-unquote, the idea of the European Union to, quote-unquote, again, normal people. And the question was also linked to some constitutional issues. Professor Brengelmann, I know the Bundesverfassungsgericht, the relationship between European law and national law. But you will agree, basically, it's the same political question. Remembering the 2005 Dutch referendum under the banner, not very convincing banner, Europa best belangrijk, Europe rather important. Well, when that was the banner, the negative result was built into the referendum. I go to the two ambassadors. Ambassador Brengelmann first. Okay. Have you switched off? No,
Limburg? Okay, that's what I guessed. Because exactly, it's true that you would imagine that people there, with their constant experience with crossing borders on both sides, because you go to Germany constantly, but you also go to Belgium easily, so you can do many things at the same time. You're in Luxembourg quickly if you like, etc. And at the same time, you find that pretty high level of skepticism. From day one of being here as the German ambassador was one of my priorities to actually also go to the border provinces. So I've been in Limburg probably more often than any of my predecessors or perhaps any other ambassador. And same is true for Gelderland or Overijssel, Drenthe, Groningen. Why? Because we have a lot of interaction across the border. We have many Germans living there, German business there. But one more thing. The European idea and the big debates in Brussels sometimes don't manage to materialize or trickle down in the sense that people really sur place will notice it. And when you speak about cross-border cooperation, it is many times overlooked that, things like the Grenzinfobund on our border, programs which are being done through the Euregios, the name does indicate it, but nobody knows, are actually done with the support and the means of the European budget. And that should help to bring people together and give them that impression that what they experience in terms of good signs of that European idea is actually down to their level. I know it's sometimes too complex, the story doesn't travel, but it is a certain reality. To the bigger story, I still believe that even nowadays, I'm being told from time to time, oh, don't talk about these old stories, the young people will not want to hear it. The European Union is not just about prosperity. We are a peace project. We are a community of values. We are together because we wanted to change the course of history of our continent, which had been what? Conflict-ridden, had been a disaster area. So we shouldn't forget why we did that. And that you can travel, okay, now it's Corona, but that in general you can travel freely, that you don't need to exchange money, that you can actually live in another country, that you can go and study in another country, Erasmus. All of that is trying to bring us together. And I think in some way we manage. When you meet people from other countries here in your class, is it really important that they are from other countries, or are you one course? Okay, you know where you're from, but I would argue that the differences are probably not so strong or not so important anymore than maybe they used to be. Your point about what is being discussed, yeah, the social issue was felt much stronger specifically when the pandemic hit. And you could see that the Portuguese presidency, the social summit in Porto, was trying to put that up higher in the agenda of the European Union. There had been resistance in the past, also from my political system, but I think the Porto summit managed to get it higher on our agenda to make sure that there is this kind of dimension as well. Another point which I believe is always important, and you referred to it in terms of how did the Dutch respond to the referendum, the identity issue. I think it's fair to say that maybe as a German I can relate to that more easily. I'm German, yes, but I'm very much a Rhinelander and Nordrhein-Westfalen, and guys from Bavaria would tell you the same. So you can be what you are also in a larger framework. We can be Europeans and at the same time still be Dutch and Germans and have our traditions, etc. I don't see a contradiction in that. I will not touch the point you referred to with the Bundesverfassungsgericht. A German diplomat would be very clever not to do that. And I would, however, like to respond to the issue of how can we as Europe and us as nations respond more actively to the challenges in our neighborhood. It's not true that we are completely out of the picture. We were not very much in the picture when it came to Syria, fair to say. Some of us did on a national basis, but not in a kind of concerted way. But it's also true that the EU or us as nations have been very active when it comes to Libya. You have the Berlin conference, it's not an American conference. Iran, it is very true that the European countries play a major role in that negotiation. Let's hope it will work out. But perhaps a little further away, it is France and Germany who try to work in that Normandy process vis-à-vis Ukraine. Very difficult work to bring them to make progress there, but we'll keep on going. So it is fair to say that with Syria and the more classic Mideast situation, we have less of an input and less of a role, but in many other areas, we're actually strongly engaged. So I would say we need to see it from situation to situation.
Yeah, very shortly, simply going back, so Middle East. Of course, you're right on one point. If you, aside from people in the region, which are obviously the first that are, let's say, impacted by evolutions in the region, we are certainly in Europe the second most affected region by anything that happens in the Middle East, simply because it is our neighboring region. I would agree with Dirk that not everything is negative. I mean, we are indeed with the E3 at the core of the diplomatic process on Iran. We've been extremely active on Libya, and things are actually right now going in the right direction with new authorities there. And again, we are trying and able to some extent to bridge the gap in that part of the world. So in fact, what you refer to, but we've been also we have also experienced some more negative experiences, and I think it's fair to say that when we said, and I abide by the strategic autonomy world, because when did we last simply see that it was an imperative? It's in Syria. So when you have an American administration that decides overnight to pull out resources from Syria, where we have been combating Daesh for 3-4 years at the time, without any coordination with us, we cannot but acknowledge that there isn't much as Europeans that we can do. And as my German colleague pointed out, we were, France, among the countries extremely present in that mission. But there were not enough European capacities to actually compensate for the US decision if we had wanted to. Then it's another discussion. Do you want to be alone as Europeans or not? But in fact, the debate is not even possible because of the lack of capacity to some extent. So in a way, I think this is the place where we see why it is imperative for us to develop our own European capacities. Then on the other point, I won't be long, but because it brings me back to the point I did earlier on European sovereignty. Yes, one of the paradoxes is that it's easier to see. I mean, the benefits are easily forgotten of the European project. They are not small. Peace on a continent, freedom of movement, possibility to create businesses abroad in one country or another, etc. All that seems the new normal, so it's forgotten, and people see the possible hurdles or difficulties that increased integration might bring. And there is an asymmetry between the two that is well known, but that we need to deal with, of course. I would simply reiterate the point that the idea that a country of 60 million like France or 18 million or 17 million like the Netherlands will be more sovereign if it's alone doesn't make sense, because in fact the ability of other countries to impose on you on their agenda will become bigger, because you will be alone, and your ability to discuss with a world power if you are by yourself, I can assure you, some other countries are experiencing or will experience very soon that it can be a pretty damaging dynamic. And there are more and more issues where we are stronger together. It's true with states, but it's true with digital platforms. It's true with like gigantic actors that will not care too much what one of us isolated thinks, and might care more if we are able to exercise leverage together. So in fact, the idea that there is a contradiction between the two sovereignties doesn't make complete sense in practical terms. On legal terms, there are debates, but on your daily life, it's not really like that.
Thank you very much. We are coming to the end of our session, I'm afraid, because it's almost 4:30, and that was the agreement. Unless there's a very urgent, specific question, very, very briefly. Follow up, I presume? Yeah, and the Ambassador Vassy, I think, can read what's written here. Will there ever come a time when France will relinquish its seat on the United Nations Security Council in favor of the European Union? If so, under which conditionality? That's, of course, up to Ambassador Vassy to answer. But I'll give you the opportunity to briefly, please. Yeah? Go ahead.
No, sorry, because it has been willingly organized that way. So you have sovereignly decided to actually pull together some resources. So, in a way, pacta sunt servanda. Then any country like Great Britain can decide to move out of the contract, but at the same time, you are approaching the issue in legal terms, and what I say is that in practice, let's say, let's think about country Z, 100,000 inhabitants. Its ability in the real life, in the balance of power, to actually impose its agenda sovereignly to the United States or China, I think is zero, to be honest. So you might be right in legal terms, even though I would argue that it's willingly that countries have entered and they had a sovereign, they made a sovereign decision to enter the overall setting. But in any case, in practical terms, in real life, you can, yeah, if you don't have the capacity to actually withstand your sovereignty or defend it, it becomes very theoretical and frankly much more on paper than anything. Security Council, that's an easy one. That's exactly to your point. The European Union is not stronger because it weakens states. We are now in a situation where at the Security Council there can be up to 5 EU countries sitting at the Security Council. So I really, in practical terms, see absolutely no like immediate benefit to saying we will dissolve ourselves and reduce our power at the Security Council. What we do is indeed coordinate together to make sure that the positions that, it's by the way in the treaties also, that the positions that we take at the Security Council are coordinated between EU members, and I can tell you that my colleagues in New York are engaging in very intense EU coordination meetings, that's their name, and I think that's for the better in terms of our influence in the world.
Thank you so much. Thank you, dear ambassadors, dear friends. Thank you so much. These events are important, and not every ambassador comes to academia and will be as open and straightforward as you have been this afternoon. And I'm saying this because I hope, and I'm addressing myself directly now to the students here in this room and online, before you know, your generation will take over the European project. And I come back again to the quote-unquote normal people questions we had from the floor here in the hall. And you should do better than my generation. That is not only my plea, it's also my belief. Because when I look at the European Union project now, and France and Germany are key players in bringing it forward at the moment, you'll have to do that very soon. And when I look at Europe now, and when I look at the Netherlands, my own country, ending with a Dutch remark, the debate on the European Union has been given to the flanks to a certain extent by political parties, I'll not mention names, who were born from the European project. And there you really should do better, is my plea and my call to you. And you need ambassadors like Ambassador Brengelmann, Ambassador Vassy, guys in this case who do it in the practice, who have the most beautiful job in the world as a diplomat. I'll still say this when I'm now 70 plus. It's a wonderful job. It's a challenging job, and you have seen the example here of what that job can entail. I have in the Dutch tradition a present for both ambassadors so that they can remember this afternoon. It stays well within the limits, of course, of what we are allowed to give under strict legal rules. One has to be careful these days. But thank you so much, Louis. Thank you so much, Dirk. And to you I say, when you're going to teach at Bonn University, I hope there will be a possibility to keep in touch. And that certainly goes, I say as the spouse of a French teacher, that certainly goes for my final remark. Dirk, you mentioned that. Languages and European languages are, in my opinion, key. Thank you ever so much. Be well, have a nice weekend, and thank you so much, dear students, for listening here in the room, and all the guys and girls online. Many thanks.